In our previous video, we examined how Russia interfered in the US election. Now let's explore why. The 4 factors that motivated Russian President Vladimir Putin most seem to be: 1. He wanted to weaken the American-led liberal democratic order. 2. He wanted to improve his standing at home by making Russia seem more formidable abroad. 3. He feared Hillary Clinton. And 4. He knew a Donald Trump presidency would serve his short-term interests. But before we get into all that, let's take a moment to understand what drives Russia's leadership. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, Vladimir Putin was a KGB spy in East Germany. After coming back to Russia, he used his newfound skills in the art of manipulation to rise through the ranks of government, making tons of connections along the way. To consolidate his power, Putin orchestrated the takeover of major oil and gas companies and Russia's biggest banks, and placed them in the hands of his loyal allies. Over the years, this type of corruption has made Putin's inner circle incredibly wealthy, at the expense of everyone else. Russia is now the most unequal country in the world, with a staggering 74% of its wealth owned by the top 1%, while the median wealth is less than $1,000. Russia's mainstream media doesn't cover this because Putin controls it too, and has even begun censoring the internet, making it virtually impossible to expose his rampant corruption. Now, nearing the end of his 4th term as president, with a stint as prime minister sandwiched in the middle, Putin's 17 years in charge have allowed him to become a master at using the levers of power to his advantage. Still, no leader can completely silence the critics and rivals who refuse to go away, but in Putin's Russia, they get thrown in jail, poisoned, or shot.
We begin with breaking news from Russia. A prominent Russian opposition politician, Boris Nemtsov, has been shot dead in central Moscow. Nemtsov rose to the post of first deputy prime minister in the last years of President Boris Yeltsin's administration. He was once considered a potential successor to Yeltsin, but he would become a leader of the opposition and a fierce critic of President Vladimir Putin.
All this makes Vladimir Putin essentially the world's biggest gangster, and he may even be its richest man. The reporting that accompanied the disclosures in the Panama Papers traced how Putin hides his cuts of deal after deal in hard-to-find offshore tax havens. How's he gotten away with this for so long? Controlling the media and terrifying his political opposition helps, but the most effective tactic is his relentless appeal to his countrymen's unique sense of nationalist pride. Russians have suffered through some tough years in the aftermath of their empire's collapse, and many have grown desperate for a hero to place little hope in. Through his relentless propaganda campaigns, Putin's convinced enough of them that he's their man.
With almost every television news channel controlled by the Kremlin, President Putin has been able to use the events in Crimea and Ukraine to rally Russians behind him.
Обратите внимание на рост рейтинга президента с начала года. Такой результат не просто личная популярность.
Извините за эту рискованную метафору. Он нащупал эту эрогенную зону, так сказать, у населения.
So that's Russia's current position. 145 million people living under one of the most powerful criminals in history, a man who seems committed to fighting until the bitter end. But Putin doesn't really fight fair, he relies on asymmetric warfare, which brings us to his operation to help make Donald Trump president of the United States. According to the mounting evidence, Donald Trump's connections with Moscow's criminal elite go way back. After a string of business failures and bankruptcies in the 1990s, Trump couldn't get any legitimate banks to give him a loan. But that didn't stop Deutsche Bank, who were in the midst of laundering the tens of billions of dollars that Putin's class of politicians and businessmen were stealing from the Russian people in the chaotic privatization of industry after the fall of the Soviet Union. The stable American real estate market was the perfect destination for a lot of this money, so Deutsche Bank began funneling hundreds of millions of dollars into Trump's properties. Before long, 1/3 of the premium units in Trump Tower were owned by people or LLCs connected to Russia, including mobsters who ran a gambling ring there. With Trump's back against the wall, with his business empire collapsing all around him, it was Russian money that came to the rescue. This goes a long way toward explaining why Trump has such a soft spot for Moscow. Fast forward to his presidential campaign. Numerous members of Trump's team met multiple times with top Russian government officials to work out a deal. Putin was especially confident he could rely on Trump's campaign manager, Paul Manafort, to hold up his end of any bargain. For a decade, Manafort was paid millions to work in Ukraine with Viktor Yanukovych, a pro-Russian politician that became president with Manafort's consulting help.
This morning, Ukrainian lawmakers revealed more details about what they say are millions of dollars of undisclosed cash payments in Paul Manafort's name. The entries were made between 2007 and 2012, when Manafort worked for the Kremlin-backed leader. Some are for computers or exit polling, but the biggest entries simply state Manafort payment or contract. Investigators say they consider any off-the-books payments to be illegal.
During this time, Manafort learned a valuable lesson. The Eastern Ukrainians who watch Russian TV could be heavily influenced by Putin's propaganda. In 2014, Manafort's time there was cut short when the deeply corrupt Yanukovych was forced to flee to Moscow when the Ukrainian people revolted after his decision to embrace Russia instead of Europe. As retribution for the new government of Ukraine's turn toward the West, Putin invaded and annexed some of Ukraine's territory. This triggered punishing sanctions against Russia from the Obama administration and the European Union, and set the stage for a deal that seems to have been struck. If Russia helped Trump win the election, Trump's administration would lift American sanctions against Russia. In the lead up to the election, at the Republican National Convention, party leaders planned to condemn Russia over its actions in Ukraine, but Trump's campaign got them to soften their stance. This would be a down payment on things to come. Sure enough, Russia unleashed its cyber army on Hillary Clinton, helping Trump become president, and shortly after his inauguration, his White House began easing sanctions on Moscow. The elephant in the room in all this is the compromising evidence the Kremlin almost certainly has on Trump, or as the Russians like to say, kompromat. The infamous dossier by a former British MI6 agent, which I discussed in my previous video, reveals that Trump was recorded in a hotel in Moscow a few years ago engaging in extracurricular acts with prostitutes. But whether this video exists or not, Moscow has other ways of blackmailing the president. During the campaign, it hacked Republican email accounts, but has not released any of what it obtained yet. So how exactly does all this benefit Putin? Since becoming president, Trump has made a number of significant moves that help Moscow, from lifting sanctions to cozying up with top Russian officials in the Oval Office and giving them highly classified US intelligence. Disclosures that have caused a deep rift of distrust between America's valuable international intelligence partners. And he's withdrawn the United States from the Paris Climate Accords. Frigid Russia is one of the few countries set to benefit from climate change, and its economy is dependent on exporting its vast reserves of oil and natural gas. So Trump just handed Putin a big win by halting America's progress in implementing ambitious CO2 limits around the world. Those are just 3 of the many issues that differentiated Donald Trump from Hillary Clinton. You'd be hard-pressed to find 2 American politicians with more differing views on Russia and the rest of the world. Not only would Clinton have continued many of President Obama's policies, but there were indications she would have been even tougher. In Syria, Clinton wanted to impose a no-fly zone that would have prevented Russia from conducting its recent air campaign there. Unlike the NATO-bashing Trump, Hillary had always been a supporter of a strong NATO alliance. In 1999, Bill Clinton's administration undertook an air campaign in Kosovo to stop human rights violations and mass killings at the hands of Yugoslavian President Slobodan Milosevic.
My fellow Americans, today our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces responsible for the brutality in Kosovo.
Moscow viewed this as an American encroachment on its traditional sphere of influence. Weeks later, Putin became president, and the Kremlin quickly adopted a new posture of consistently opposing US-led humanitarian wars. As Obama's Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton was one of the chief proponents of the NATO air campaign that supported the rebels in their civil war against Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. When Gaddafi was swiftly killed, it's reported that Putin felt deeply threatened. A few weeks after that, Putin's United Russia Party won a parliamentary election that many Russian journalists, activists, and members of the public viewed as fraudulent. Many foreign leaders, including Hillary Clinton, were critical of Moscow for manipulating the vote. In the weeks that followed, Russians took to the streets in the tens of thousands to demand fair elections. Struggling to overcome the first large-scale protests in his more than decade-long rule, Putin turned to his favorite strategy, the besieged fortress move. When in trouble, claimed that the Americans are influencing Russia's internal affairs. He said, without evidence, that hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign money was being used to influence Russian politics, and that Clinton had personally spurred protesters to action. This event has been cited recently by American media as evidence for why Putin hated Clinton, but a more accurate description is that he feared her, or at least what a Clinton presidency would mean for his own future. See, Putin is a deeply conservative politician, whereas Clinton has a long history of fighting for race, gender, and gay rights. Putin knew that if a strong woman was leading the United States of America, the male-dominated Russian Orthodox Church-backed status quo he serves would come under intense pressure to reform. It's important here, I think, to note that although many American voters may have viewed Hillary as a flawed candidate, Clinton was deeply respected by other leaders around the world. So Putin clearly assessed that he had to either defeat Clinton or delegitimize her victory as much as possible by sowing doubt about the integrity of the election. As I touched on at the beginning of this video, the image Putin projects at home is North Korean-esque, the indispensable leader. But to live up to that role, he must constantly make Russia seem more important on the world stage than it actually is. That's no easy feat, and it's exactly why Putin has become so reliant on Orwellian propaganda. He's acutely aware that Russia is exactly what Obama said it is, a regional power at best. Its fossil fuel-heavy economy is not built for the future, its brightest young people constantly leave for better opportunities abroad, and its culture of extreme wealth inequality and rampant corruption is eating away at the country from within. In 2018, Putin will decide whether to seek a fifth term as president. If he decides to step down, he'll at least need to make sure his successor is someone he trusts so he can make a clean getaway. With that contest on the horizon, what better way to make people think you've been a strong leader than by having your name constantly on the tip of everyone else in the world's tongue? Just think about how many times I've said the words Russia and Putin in this video. So Putin's solution for how to make that happen, of course, was to inject Russia into the world's most covered event. But of all the reasons why Putin did this, the most obvious to me may also be the most dangerous. He saw that he had a clear shot to weaken the liberal democratic order he'd been fighting against his entire career, so he took it. NATO, the military alliance that secures the European Union, has expanded over the decades to include countries on Russia's western border. Putin has used his propaganda machine to play the besieged fortress card, arguing that NATO is a threat to Russia. It's not. The European ideals of democracy, cooperation, and unity would only help open Russian society and bring prosperity to its people. But of course, Putin hates this idea. So, Russia's two most recent border wars in Georgia and Ukraine were primarily waged out of Putin's desire to punish those countries for cultivating closer relations with Europe. And then on Brexit, Putin's propaganda and troll factories went full throttle to influence the UK's disastrous decision to leave the EU. Through the years, Britain has been the Union's most consistent critic of Russia, so its exit is a huge win for the Kremlin. Which brings us to the US election. Nothing could have made Putin happier than seeing Donald Trump out on the campaign trail bashing NATO day after day.
NATO is obsolete. It was 67 years, or it's over 60 years old.
Even after becoming president, Trump has continued to badmouth America's most important military alliance. It's no wonder then that Trump is already the most unpopular leader of a major country in the world, and he's single-handedly bringing down people's views of the United States. Not that Putin fares much better than Trump, but he knows that it's much easier for Russia to get what it wants with America's influence around the world severely weakened. Most damaging of all, Russia's assault on our democracy is eroding trust in the very institution that has made America so prosperous, our government, elected by the people. I think the former director of the FBI, fired by Trump because he wouldn't stop investigating Russia's interference in the election, said it best.
This big, messy, wonderful country where we fight with each other all the time, but nobody tells us what to think, what to fight about, what to vote for, except other Americans. And that's wonderful and often painful, but we're talking about a foreign government that, using technical intrusion and lots of other methods, tried to shape the way we think, we vote, we act. That is a big deal. And people need to recognize it. It's not about Republicans or Democrats. They're coming after America, which I hope we all love equally. They want to undermine our credibility in the face of the world. They think that this great experiment of ours is a threat to them, and so they're going to try to run it down and dirty it up as much as possible. That's what this is about, and they will be back because we remain, as difficult as we can be with each other, we remain that shining city on the hill, and they don't like it.
Thanks for watching. For TDC, until next time, I'm Bryce Plank.